Hi, and welcome back to a Matter of Fraud podcast. Today, my guest is Keith Elliott. Keith is the president and CEO of Reed Research, a licensed, and I would say preeminent private investigations firm here in Ontario. So Keith has been a licensed private investigator for 30 years. That's right. And is a designated master investigator, as well as a certified fraud examiner, like us here at Investigation Counsel. And Keith is also part of the Certified International Investigators Association. So here at Investigation Counsel, we often look to Keith and the expertise of him and his team at Reed Research to assist our investigations on fraud recovery cases. And so today we're just going to be talking about how the relationship works between private investigators and law firms, specifically in the fraud recovery context, and how, really essential the work of Keith and his team at Reed Research is to some of our files. So hi, Keith. Thank you for joining me. I like to ask guests kind of about their origin story. I think it's interesting to kind of give listeners or viewers a little bit of background about various guests. So my question for you is there a defining moment or something memorable that brought you into the private investigations world, or something that kind of led you to where you are today?
Interesting question. Yeah, for sure. Since a young child, I've always had an innate sense of right and wrong. So at an early age, it was kind of that dream of, I want to be a cop. I want to be a police officer early on. So in high school, I started fine-tuning into that. And I thought, okay, I went to school for law and security administration with the intent of being a police officer. And then at the same time, I knew that that was a difficult road to go down. So I got into private investigations as a bridge that I could do part-time. I was floor walking, catching shoplifters. I was going to school to learn about fraud and deception, and all the rest of that would do well for a policing career. When I finished school, our NDP government was in power with Bob Rae, and they were not hiring provincially in any capacity. So I stayed in private investigations at the time, because it was continued to be a good bridge. I could get surveillance experience and backgrounds and checks and arrest people for shoplifting, a variety of things that have evolved in the surveillance area of things. And I just never left. I just kind of evolved into that where I thought, okay. And at the time, my wife was on the OPP. She was a police officer. I saw what that looked like. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to do that. So then it just kind of evolved into what I did. And what I did fairly well. And continued to get into that side of things with some speaking and client development and things, and just evolved into the piece where ultimately I own my own shop.
That's great. That's interesting that you say that about your childhood, because I've kind of thought that about myself too. I kind of have this innate thing where like injustice ticks me off.
Yeah.
I think to a certain extent, maybe not more so than the average person, but just it really kind of grinds my gears.
The Jiminy Cricket factor. Like Jiminy Cricket's on your shoulder.
Yeah.
And you're just kind of tweaking.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and then I guess what you said is correct. I mean, that private investigations world is almost like not exactly the same as a, private police officer or private law enforcement, but right. They kind of do the same things at certain times. Like you're writing reports, you're doing surveillance, you're following up, searching for bad guys, trying to figure out,
right.
what really happened. So yeah, I can see how that was a path and this presented itself, and that just kind of made sense. But I was going to say also that, private investigations, I think from our perspective here at the fraud recovery, in the fraud recovery world, I should say, are really vital in a lot of cases, in a variety of situations. But I wondered about, in your experience at Reed Research, like how much of your private investigations files do have to do with that element of fraud or are directly connected to fraud? Is there like a percentage or
So it's hard to give that number because I've got a tainted skew on it already, because by the time they get to us, they've already gone through a fair bit of filters. When it comes to being flagged for certain things, there's causation, there's different things that have occurred. So what we see is a large volume of fraud or fraud-related files because they're coming to us for that purpose, right? I wouldn't say we do a lot of claims files relating to insurance or disability and long-term disability, short-term disability, workman's comp, internal theft, product liability, that kind of stuff. And I would say that that percentage is much lower. However, there is an element of, I break it into 2 or 3 different categories wherein there's opportunistic fraud, wherein people realize they can get away with it. As we know with CFEs, if the checks and balances aren't in place, then that becomes that opportunistic piece, and we see that capitalized on. There are people that sort out to just do straight up fraud. They're not concerned or whatever. And then there's other people that are victimized into it for different issues or don't realize that they're the pawn in the play. And then that element comes as well. So I can't give a definitive number with respect to a percentage, but I would definitely say that for the most part, what we're involved in has a fraud element or fraud elements to it in upwards of 80% of the time, because of the fact that it's already coming to us for a reason, right?
Right.
They're not investigating. Take a long-term disability claim case for a second. Somebody's got cancer. They're not typically investigating somebody that has cancer. They're investigating things that are subjective, right? That aren't concrete, that are, I have a chronic bad back and I can't do this and it should have cured itself by now, or they're not recovering as quickly from surgery as they should have, and they're working on a side hustle or whatever the elements are. Those are the opportunistic pieces, right? But the people that go out to defraud that scenario, it's a much smaller margin. It's the proverbial bad 5-10%.
Right. Yeah. So then I guess you really intersect with kind of that element of potential or real dishonesty on like a pretty frequent basis.
Yeah, you trip across.
Yeah. How do you not get jaded, right? Like, how do you not?
It's a great question. It's hard because you do look at it from that lens.
Yeah.
You have people that are like, oh, I have this, have that. And you just kind of like, if they're friends or their family, it kind of puts the heckles up on your back, because we do have that lens where we see it, we hear the same excuses or the same stories, and it makes you think, whatever the case is. Yeah.
I had a judge say to me, I think when I was just starting out practicing litigation and fraud recovery, I think like the comment was, try not to get jaded, or try not to kind of look at everything through that lens.
Yeah.
Type of thing. So yeah, you do kind of have to remind yourself once in a while that, okay, there could be an innocent explanation for this all.
For sure.
So I thought it might be helpful to listeners or viewers to kind of explain through like a conversation between Keith and I about how private investigations and Keith and his team at Reed Research help us in the various stages in our fraud recovery cases. So the first one being investigative services at the outset of a claim. So we'll often come to Keith at Reed Research and retain them to assist in a case at the very beginning. So this is to help us do locate and surveillance on potential or actual defendants, to engage in some pre-litigation asset searches and things like that. So we know what assets exist, and we can make sure that those aren't dissipated throughout the litigation. And we also ask Keith to look at things like social media, publicly available searches. And maybe Keith can just tell us a little bit about the types of searches that we might do at the outset of a case.
So typically when you guys are coming to us with a case, you're coming with a problem and a target. There's usually 2 things that go hand in hand. Your problem is there's a chunk of money missing, or this has occurred, this fraud's occurred, and the target is this person or these people. And so with that, we tend to try to build a profile for you as to what they are, much like you said. So I want to identify who they are, where they live, if they have assets, what they are, where they're kept, those types of things. So we look at it from a multitude of different ways. The first one we always look at is what we refer to as OSINT, so open source intelligence. That's everything that's publicly available. That is your social media. That is your newspaper clippings if they've been charged criminally before. That is the courts. The courts are public information. People don't recognize that, but that is public. Tax rolls are public. If you own a home and you're paying tax in a municipal area, that is public record. Your liens and loans on a vehicle, so your personal registrations on vehicles or any property that you own that has a lien against it is public record. These are all public resources because they're operating registered through our government system, so therefore they're publicly accessible. So we look at that. We look at actions in other courts, small claims. Is somebody else suing them? Is there already people in line ahead of them? You guys do similar before we know that, and whether or not there's actually reason to recover for that. Now, a lot of the times it's not just them, it's a spouse, it's children, it's other parallel pieces because they don't put it through themselves. They dissipate those assets through other divisions, whether it's companies or whatever. That's where it gets a little more difficult in identifying some of those pieces. To identify if someone's registered in a company, in Ontario, you can't search by name. You have to search by a specific corporation. So if you don't have the details of that corporation, then that's where you start to have to peel back the layers of the onion to try to find those through other parallel things. Okay, is there a second owner on this home, or was it sold by a business, and do they have connection to that home, or they sold the home to a business, which is usually them trying to liquidate assets and stuff. So we'll start diving into those pieces and look for those elements. If they're been named on defaulting for a lease, then now we have a company name because it was leased under a company name. And it is just a series of layers that we have to try to build this map of who they are and what they're connected to as much as possible to get that information and then go forward from there.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of in kind of that, you see it in the crime shows all the time, that kind of like spider web chart.
Yeah. So it's an I2 map. It's referred to as an I2 map, and we map it out accordingly. And there's software for that we plug in those criteria, and then it does the interconnectivity of that piece.
But it's helpful, like you said, to keep track of all those moving parts. I mean, because that's one thing we do like some preliminary type investigations here at the firm, but that's one thing that, I mean, you guys really excel at, and I think is really important for our private investigators to keep everything organized and keep those connections concrete and evidence-based and all of those things. And so then once we have kind of the profile or our I2 chart created, then we might head into some like physical location and surveillance type services, which are useful.
So those are incredibly useful. I always say that we are in the service of HUMINT intelligence. So OSINT is your open source intelligence. And then you have the HUMINT, which is your human intelligence. And those are things that aren't publicly available that you can't resource, but you would be surprised on how much information is garnered over conducting physical surveillance on a location or a person to see a variety of things. So a house alone, you pull up, it's 4 a.m, there's vehicles in the driveway. Those aren't necessarily registered to your target or your subject. They're registered to a corporation, or they're leased to a third party or whatever. So now we have other leads we can follow up on. There's simple concept of who comes and goes from the home, who's visiting, who's leaving, who's coming in, who's going out. If it's our specific target that we're after and there's surveillance, now we see where they go, what they do, who they interact with, what bank card they use, what credit cards they use, are all gathering information for us that allow us. So we'll shoulder surf at someone at a transaction that I see that MasterCard that they pulled out doesn't necessarily have their name on it. Maybe it has a corporation name on it or something along those lines, and we can facilitate those pieces to get that information.
All right.
And those are leads. If they go to a bank, then you guys can facilitate orders for track and trace, through no-arch orders or otherwise. That allows us to get that further information and complete parts of the puzzle we didn't know existed.
Yeah, so that locate and surveillance information is really
I think they're hand in hand too, though, right? Because we can always have the OSINT piece that's out there publicly, And then we have the surveillance or the HUMINT piece that we need to verify the information that we've obtained, but also establish new leads because they can post whatever they want. They can put whatever they want on paper. And the example I always give is we do some executive background checks and stuff on individuals that are being hired for really high trust positions and dealing with trading or billions of dollars of industry. And that resume looks spot on perfect. But what you won't see is that this individual has a gambling propensity that after work Fridays, every day, he goes to Woodbine Racetrack and drops 10 grand and starts drinking heavily and gets in his car and drive home. No piece of paper is going to show that unless he's been caught, right? So that physical observations is important to identify their lifestyle and those issues. And you think of all the cases that you and I work together where that surveillance piece is kind of giving us that, oh, hang on, this is what we've been looking for, right? Because we're trying to find that piece. And then all of a sudden they go to the storage locker, they go to the mom's house where the missing piece of the puzzle is, or the blue Lamborghini is, or whatever.
Yeah. And creating that context because we use the information that we gather through the investigations to create the story that we as lawyers then present to the court in support of whatever the relief is that we're seeking. So in often cases, or, in every case where we're seeking an Anton Pillar order, which is the equivalent of a private search warrant that's available in Ontario through the common law. So this is a search and seizure type of order that is provided by the courts in Ontario to allow private parties like lawyers, investigators, to seize and preserve evidence necessary in a pending piece of litigation. And the Anton Pillar order is an example where I would say this locate and surveillance evidence is absolutely crucial. I wouldn't seek an Anton Pillar order unless I had resources from somebody like Keith and that actual locate and surveillance verified, because that's really, otherwise you're going in blind.
There's also there's case law to that effect too, right? You guys have shared that says that if we don't find the right person, you're going to be liable civilly for hitting the wrong door or the wrong person.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of a case in Ontario. It's called Cicada. And that was a case where the alleged fraudster was alleged to have made off with tens of millions in cryptocurrency. And they had located what they thought was this person's house and showed up with the Anton Pillar order. But the primary target individual was already gone and had took his electronics with him. And so the only people that remained at the house were his parents. And so the Anton Pillar was useless, basically. The object of the order being the cryptocurrency and the electronics was gone. And then everything was exposed because the parents were there and sort of the jig was up in terms of the investigation. Surprise element, investigation, litigation, and everything like that. So unfortunately, in that case, it doesn't appear that they had surveillance and locate conducted in order to confirm that the target was actually at the property before, knocking on the door. So that's just an example of how it can go really wrong if you don't.
And sometimes that piece too takes a substantial piece. Like you and I have more cases where that has taken a large chunk of time because of how they ship and where they bounce around to and all the different elements. So it is a bit of an investment, but you get one shot at it, right?
Yeah.
So if you don't do it right and you don't do it accurately, then you are giving it up because you've showed your cards.
Yeah.
You lose a surprise element.
Yeah, that's right. And then in that case, the Cicada case, there was allegation that the parents either tipped him off or knew where he was and weren't disclosing that information. So it can really be like a case killer for sure. But I'm so surprised by you and your team's creativeness to locate these people. It's really, I think, remarkable. And then, so once we get through that initial stage here at Investigation Counsel, then we'll move on with the litigation, utilizing and using the investigative services and reports from Keith and his team. However, we need them throughout the litigation, whether that's seeking extraordinary orders like the Anton Pillar order or Moravian injunctions to freeze assets that we've identified and located. We'll move through the litigation, and then investigation services can become really important then again kind of at the end. And this includes after a judgment has been issued. So this includes to help locate assets to execute against, to possibly, again, engage in surveillance or location services if assets have been transferred to third parties in the fraudulent conveyance context, or something similar. And in that case, we might be looking at third parties, spouses, children, that sort of thing. So on the Anton Pillar orders in Ontario, we also use Keith and his team to assist on the actual execution of those orders. And so that includes things like recording the entire event, assistance with the actual search process of it all. And it's necessary to kind of document everything that takes place within that because it's a very highly scrutinized type of order that's provided by the court. And so Keith would assist us in basically documenting the whole thing, and him and his team. And then that way we have a video and audio recording of the entire execution. And that really protects, us and our clients, as well as provides the court with a documented record of everything that took place, everything that was searched, everything that was seized. And so that kind of assistance is really invaluable to us too. So next I want to kind of talk about something that I think I've noticed here, increase in our cases at Investigation Counsel, and I'm sure that you have too in your work, which is really the rise and the increase in the use of, I'll call them rogue online identities or rogue online actors. So there's really been an increase in cases where people are dealing with quote unquote individuals who they've met on the internet. And oftentimes we find out that those identities are false. So is that something that you're seeing an increase of?
Yeah, so absolutely. We refer to them as synthetic IDs. So the synthetic IDs are basically anything that's fraudulent or fake and been utilized in a variety of capacities. They've always existed. Fake IDs have always existed, and fake personas have always existed. I think the increase that you're seeing is the advent of AI. Artificial intelligence has allowed those to become that more fulsome and more believable in the context wherein you get into the concept of deep fakes. And with enough audio and video recording of individuals and your voice and stuff, you can change those. And you can represent them, A, to be a specific party, or B, do a stream where it's your fake profile of a person that is actually talking in a Zoom call, and it's not you. You have no chance of being identified. And there's a variety of software that's out there, free, available online, not dark web, that is for promotional purposes or people doing advertising where they don't have to pay for an actor or otherwise. They can use these third parties, and it's a synthetic ID. And you write the script for this thing, and that spits out what you want, or you can literally have it as an overlay through a green screen type technology where it is interacting with individuals. So they think they're talking to this individual. I've talked to them, I'm Zoomed with them, I met with them, but it's not that person at all. So there's that element. And then on the simplest level, from documents and document fraud and accounts and account takeover and all those elements, it's just so much easier now to facilitate because of the fact that AI is growing at such a rapid pace. The fraudsters are conducting it, utilizing it very fulsomely, because there's no rules for the fraudsters. Yet there's a heck of a lot of rules for us and how we operate and how we register things and everything else. So we're behind the curve when it comes to the elements of how we be able to identify and detect. And so that has had that increase, and these individuals can act with impunity of not getting caught because there's no concern. We had a string of stolen rental vehicles in the last couple of years where people were utilizing that in their fake driver's licenses and everything else being used through car ride share apps or people using Airbnbs and emptying the house out, stealing all the stuff out of it, furniture and everything else, fraudulent credit cards. And then on the simplest of levels of now we get into the crypto and their crypto accounts and they're interacting with these individuals and they think it's this guy from South Carolina. That's not. He's from Nigeria or whatever the case is. And so, yeah, it's definitely increased on that. And it is more difficult now. We have to show that much more diligence, I think, when we're dealing with things to be able to identify them. But we're already behind because by the time they come to you or me, the fraud's already occurred.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a really challenging case when we run into that. And oftentimes the victim doesn't know that they've been dealing with a rogue or synthetic ID. So we discover that and then we break that news to them too, that this person that you thought you were dealing with, that you sent all this money to, actually doesn't exist. And that name is fake and that driver's license is fake. And
I think if we can have them still engaged, wherein when they come to us and we know, or we've done a few of these of late without getting into specifics, where we have the proverbial live fish on the end of the line where there's still interaction, to be able to facilitate that interaction, it allows us to structure it in the way of a bit of a sting to find out who that person is or get some telling information and get a little more detail and get that extra Zoom link or stuff that we can look at and investigate and have some teeth to it, or do another transaction that we can track and trace, things along those lines that we know. It helps immensely, right? Because now we kind of have them and we can bait them a little bit and they think that it's still just their dupe on the other end of the line and the victim, and we can get those elements. So I think that's too, when we identify that, we need to stay engaged too, as opposed to shutting it down and not letting the cat out of the bag, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, that makes sense because you're limited in what you can do when you're dealing with a synthetic ID.
Yeah.
Because it's literally becomes a needle in a haystack at that point. But if there's still that element of communication, you might be able to kind of tease that true individual ID out of them through the assistance of fraud recovery lawyers and investigators.
And the hardest element with that is, in this day and age, what you really need to be able to get something is you need 2 or 3 items. You need a phone number. Well, you can have a burner phone, and they're available to walk into any phone retailer place. I'd buy and pay for it on a vanilla credit card, which is a card that was paid for in cash, like a gift card. I load $2,000 on a vanilla Visa, and I get myself a brand new iPhone with a plan. And so I've got a credit card and I need an email address, and then I get a phone number. Well, if I have a vanilla Visa card, then I got the credit card, I create a phone number, and I have a synthetic ID that the phone carrier person isn't trained in identifying a fraudulent ID. They look at it, thinks it's legitimate. It's like, this is my driver's license. Yeah, that's a driver's license. It fits all the criteria that I knew about the driver's license. They don't look at that with that finite piece. And lo and behold, they now have a phone, and a workable phone that charges every month and let it go. And between the phone and their ID, well, what do you need to open any account with a bank? An email address, which you can get anywhere. You need a phone for 2-factor authentication, and you need a piece of ID. So now you walk into a bank and you facilitate the exact same thing because now you have the phone. And so now you walk in, I got a credit card, I've got a phone, I've got an email address, and now I have a bank account. And we can just slowly snowball that over one illegitimate piece that can be built on accordingly. And again, a teller straight out of university that is signing you up for an account, or a financial advisor that's 22 years old and doesn't know the difference between RSP and a TFSA or otherwise, isn't trained on what the proper driver's license does. They may not even have their own driver's license. So to count on them to be able to do this, we're lacking. And it's about, the more accounts we sign up, the better off we are. And some of the measures that we've gotten into our industry of commodifying every single thing quicker, faster, better has allowed the fraudsters to capitalize on this. That's where I think the synthetics are coming out of. It's just that they're capitalizing on the fact that nobody's really looking at it.
Yeah, that's right. And I've run into this in the context of finding out that bank accounts were opened using fake identification. And the bank's mandate, all that they have to do is basically record the information from the ID. They don't even keep a picture of it to verify photo. They just write down the fake driver's license number.
And then when you come to me to run it, I'm like, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean?
Or like, it's so obviously fake. It's not even the right alphanumerical code.
Yeah.
And then there's like the expiry date isn't matching, or the birth date's not matching those things. And so it's like, okay, what good is having this mandate that the banks have to record this ID information if nobody's actually verifying it at all?
Yeah.
But have you, or like, do you have a story that you could share with us about kind of exposing that rogue online identity?
Or Rogers number, we can figure those out. And it doesn't fit the profile for what we're seeing. So I'm like, okay, this is not, it's a VoIP, it's a voice over IP number, or it's a forwarding number. So now we're kind of, there's nothing we can get at that point. We're like, what do we get? So we would randomly engage in conversation with this individual under the premise of the fact that we all get phone calls where someone says, hey, you just called me. And they're like, no, I didn't. And they're like, no, I can show you. My voicemail says you called me, and you didn't know why you called me. He's like, do I know you? And they're like, no. And we engage with them a little bit that way and see if they bite. And this is a regular thing now where you'll get phone numbers and, hey, do you have a moment to chat? Or did you get that thing I sent you? And people will interact. So the fraudsters utilize that, and it's known as pig butchering. And the fraudsters will utilize that to engage and get someone to interact. So we flip it on them and do the same thing. One of the things we'll often do if we know that our rogue or our synthetic is a particular demographic, we'll go after that individual with we know what's going to work, whether it's gaming, whether it's romance, whether it's interaction on that level. So the one particular case, we just said, oh, hi, how are you? Whatever, I'm bored, you want to talk or whatever. And we used a female persona.
Mm-hmm.
And the honey trap is set wherein we bait the trap with the honey, the sweet sounding girl.
Mm-hmm.
And the young gentleman bites. Mm-hmm. And we were able to build up the story. And it probably took close to 2 months to pin this individual down. And we thought we had him because she was going to come over and visit. They now have this interaction online, and he's teasing back and forth. They're sending photos. Hers is fake, his is real. So we know we have the right guy, but we have to do all that surveillance. And he's bouncing on different credit cards and cash payment transfers to different Airbnbs. He's doing 1 month rentals. Just when we think we have him, he moves again. And so we finally were able to interact with him from the point of view that we got some information wherein they had interacted, and he said he had Uber Eats. So we did a delivery element with respect to Uber Eats. And we also felt that we were going to, so we spoofed that in part where we got the Uber Eats and said, your delivery's on the way. And he's like, well, we need to confirm the address. And then he provides an address with us. And we're able to get that piece. And then he thinks she's coming to visit him at one point because he thinks he's possibly going to get lucky or get to meet this lovely young lady. And it was us knocking at the door with the Anton.
That's remarkable. I love that, especially the aspect of turning that technology and those, I guess, methods that are often used by fraudsters to execute a fraud then against them.
And the text chain on that is just awesome because he says, oh, I used a fake name because I didn't know if you were scamming me or baiting me, but now, oh, you're real.
Yeah.
And it's funny. So.
Nice.
Yeah.
So that's a great one. Now, I might be biased, but I think that Keith and his team at Reed Research are really a cut above the rest when it comes to investigation services. And really one of the, or I guess two of the reasons why I would say that is because the quality of the reports and also the creativity in getting the job done.
Thank you.
And so I guess this is just kind of a broad question, but is there something that's in your secret sauce at Reed Research that you would say really puts you above the rest? Like,
if I told you the secret sauce, it wouldn't be for a secret that you are. But no, I will give you an answer. Right? It's our people.
Yeah.
The secret sauce is our people. You've met a lot of our team. You've dealt with them or whatever. They're all highly professional. They're motivated. It's not about the paycheck or whatever. They want to rise to that level of professionalism and to be the best in the business.
Yeah.
And to be those guys. It's not just a job. These are lifelong career individuals that are doing fraud and fraud investigation for that same element that I started with at the beginning about the innate sense of right and wrong, right? They just don't like it. It drives them nuts. And so there's definitely that group. And then also a good group of people weeds out a bad apple in a heart, right? Like if you have somebody that wants to be part of the team and then don't fit the cohesiveness that we have with our team, that allows it. So there's not a lot of difficulty in us working together, which makes things that much more enjoyable, easier to do, and give you clients that more fulsome piece, because it's not just about that element. And again, it's customer service too, right? It's the element of being able to interact with people, talk to them, get to know them, and know what they need, and just cut through that. But I think it's just that element of the people are what make the team the best. So
Yeah, because it's easy to get discouraged. I assume when you're in the middle of that investigation and you're coming up on dead ends and you got to think creatively, and you really have to rely on your dedication to kind of solving that puzzle, I think.
And the piece too is you guys never have any pressure for us to perform. The response is always there's no pressure, do the best you can. We know you can't win them all, right?
Yeah.
So that alone in itself doesn't put this high level of demand on that, and it just lets you do your job a little more comfortably and relaxes a little bit, where you get to have that creative juice flow. So that's a big compliment to you guys too, right? Like in the sense of it's important that you just kind of let it flow.
Yeah, because ultimately we don't know what we don't know, and 99% of the time Keith tells us a big long story that we didn't know existed. So that's good. I did just want to touch on the fact that you do a lot of speaking engagements now. So I know that you're hired often as a keynote speaker. And how did that come about? Or is that something you really enjoy doing? Or
it's funny, I hated it as a child. And we had to do public speaking like grade 7 and grade 8. Like I cringed, like I didn't want to have to do it at all. And I was actually, believe it or not, the shy kid up until about high school. But it's something that I think it was a self-confidence thing. And I realized that when I embraced it, it was enjoyable and I liked it and I like people. I like telling stories or interacting with individuals on that level. So it has evolved through time as well. It's probably been 15 years to get to the point where we're at now. But I enjoy that element. It's a lot of hard work, but it's kind of like that you're giving back, right? So that element to be able to give back, to educate the next ring or a round of fraud investigators or fraud professionals, be it through the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners or different organizations that we're all involved in, but the ACFE in particular has been very supportive of that, and they come to mind, and that just generates more. And if you do something well, then you're asked to do it again, and it seems to cycle that way. Mm-hmm. And then again, having some good stories and some good results always helps as well.
Yeah. You have something to back up your speech.
Yeah.
But I know, like, as have had the pleasure of being in the crowd for some of Keith's speeches before, and like one of the things that I always walk away with is like at least one piece of really practical information that I can either take back to my clients, implement in practice, or even just use in my personal life. In terms of, turning off certain tracking settings on your phone, or did you know that you can be exposed through this way? Because I think at the end of the day, that's what a lot of people are missing too, is really that practical guidance of how can you protect yourself. And
so one of the things I always say is we just need to pause, like stop rushing through everything. Like the frauds occur because they capitalize on that element of people not pausing for a second. Sure, you're expecting a UPS or an Uber delivery or an Amazon delivery, but when that link comes up on your phone, don't hit it, hit pause, go to the source, go directly where you are, because it's that click that gets you the malware, or it's that click that gets you frauded into your bank account, or that you put in about your bank account. So it's always that element, right? And the fraudsters are playing on that sense of urgency that we have. And we all just need to slow down a little bit, take a breath, flow on or whatever. And so that element is.
Yeah. And that's the practical piece that we're going to leave people with today. That's really important. A lot of our cases, unfortunately, do have that element of urgency where the fraudster utilizes urgency to try to put pressure on the situation, to try to make people not ask those questions that would have potentially exposed the fraud. So If you're listening, take a minute, breathe,
Pause.
Don't send your money unless you know exactly what you're dealing with. And so just to close out, I was wondering if you had a favorite investigation story.
I do, but I don't know many of them can make the camera.
It must be safe for web.
Must be safe for web.
Yeah.
Adult content excluded.
Yeah.
I do like the stories of individuals wherein trying to find them when they're just the rogue and out there. And one of the ones that comes to mind is parallel to our Tyler character that I referenced before, and he would have been part of the same massive fraud. And he was living off the grid in an area outside of Ottawa. And then we were actually together at the fraud conference, and we were chatting about this one and working with Jeff and Norm and stuff. And I was like doing spot checks on this because we got a lead through some information that said he had a disabled child and that he treated the child to McDonald's every Thursday. That after the kid was picked up from school. So we went and we staked out the McDonald's for like 3 weeks on Thursdays. And then lo and behold, we found our rogue comes through the driving parking lot with the kid in tow, and then leads us out to a farm property, another 30 minutes out in the middle of nowhere. And he's living in a rented quasi trailer / chicken coop and living completely off the grid, using Starlink for his internet, and is completely untraceable. Everything's done through crypto and everything else, and he thought he was bulletproof, but apparently he still needs McDonald's.
Yes.
So,
when the need for McDonald's is greater than the need to stay off the grid.
Yeah.
That's great. So with that, Keith, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for speaking to me, and look forward to working